The autumn fog of 1894 had settled upon London like a shroud, transforming the familiar streets into a labyrinth of shadows and gaslight. It was on such an evening, when the very air seemed thick with mystery, that the curtain fell upon one of the most baffling theatrical murders that Scotland Yard had ever encountered. The Royal Caledonian Theatre in Drury Lane stood ablaze with light against the October gloom, its facade gleaming like a jewel in the crown of London's West End. Inside, the house was packed to capacity for the opening night of The Masque of Macedon, starring the celebrated Sir Alistair Beaumont, whose commanding presence had dominated the London stage for nearly 2 decades. The audience, a mixture of society luminaries in their silk and diamonds, and working folk pressed shoulder to shoulder in the galleries, buzzed with anticipation as the orchestra tuned their instruments and the limelight operators made their final adjustments. Sir Alistair, resplendent in his costume as King Philip of Macedon, commanded the stage with the authority that had made him the darling of theatrical London. His iron-grey hair caught the footlights as he delivered his lines with that rich baritone voice that could fill the largest theatre without strain. Behind him, the elaborate scenery depicted a palace corridor in scrolled gilt, with painted columns receding into perspective and a black velvet curtain concealing the ancient trapdoor mechanism that would serve the climactic scene. The fourth act had reached its crescendo. The conspirators pressed forward, their daggers gleaming in the limelight as King Philip, with a defiant oath, drew his own jeweled blade, a stage property that had served faithfully for 3 seasons without incident. The music swelled, the lighting narrowed to a dramatic spot, and Sir Alistair, following the choreography rehearsed to perfection that very afternoon, turned to make his escape through the trapdoor that would carry him beneath the stage and up to the balcony above for his final, triumphant speech. The trapdoor opened with its familiar soft slap, and the great actor dropped from sight as planned, his cloak billowing dramatically in the controlled descent. The audience held its collective breath, waiting for his reappearance upon the balcony. 1 beat passed, then 2, then 3. The orchestra faltered. A violin squealed discordantly. Miss Lila Rowntree, the leading lady, missed her cue and glanced desperately toward the wings. Then came the cry, thin, high, and unmistakably human in its anguish from somewhere beneath the stage. What followed transformed a night of theatrical triumph into one of horror and bewilderment. The curtain fell with a crash as stagehands rushed to the trap mechanism. Mr. Basil Fenwick, the theatre manager, his face flushed with panic, shouted down the speaking tube to the understage area. "Pike! Horace Pike! What in God's name has happened?" No answer came from the master carpenter who operated the ancient but reliable mechanism. Within minutes, the understage area swarmed with men carrying lanterns, their faces white with shock and sawdust. There, upon the feather mattress that had cushioned countless dramatic descents, lay Sir Alistair Beaumont. His grease paint could not disguise the pallor of death, and his eyes stared sightlessly at the timber beams above. Most shocking of all was the neat wound just below his left breast, from which a thin trickle of blood had already begun to darken his elaborate costume. The stage dagger, that harmless prop with its dulled edge and gilt decoration, lay a yard away where it had fallen during the descent, as innocent as a child's toy. There was no other weapon to be found. Horace Pike, the master carpenter, stood frozen beside the counterweight mechanism, his weathered face a mask of incomprehension. He fell clean, he muttered hoarsely. Nothing but the feather bed below, as always. There was nothing to harm, in him nothing at all. The small chamber beneath the trap had only 2 exits, the narrow stair by which the rescuers had descended, and a small iron door leading to the lateral passage that connected to the carpenter's workshop. This second door was found bolted from within, its ancient iron fixture secured as if it had not been touched in years. No one could recall having bolted it, and no one confessed to the deed. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived within the hour, summoned by a fleet-footed messenger who had raced through the fog-shrouded streets. By then, the audience had been dismissed with explanations of Sir Alistair's sudden illness, though whispers of something far more sinister had already begun to circulate. The inspector, lean and sharp-featured, picked his way through the maze of ropes and scenery with the careful precision of a man accustomed to crime scenes, though none quite like this. A singular case indeed. Lestrade murmured as he examined the wound with professional detachment. The puncture was clean and narrow, made by something far more precise than any stage property. Yet the understage area had been searched thoroughly, and no weapon could be found. Mr. Jenkins, the property master, demonstrated the harmlessness of the stage dagger by scraping it vigorously against his own palm, leaving only a smear of gilt paint. "Blunt as a butter knife, Inspector," he declared. "Couldn't cut warm bread, let alone harm a man." The divisional surgeon, summoned from his comfortable fireside, confirmed what was already evident. Sir Alistair had been killed by a narrow, sharp instrument thrust between his ribs with surgical precision. Death had been swift, but the weapon had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. As the night wore on and the mystery deepened, Lestrade found himself confronting an impossible crime. A man had been murdered in full view of 1,000 witnesses, yet the murder had occurred in a locked chamber beneath the stage. With no weapon present and no means for the killer to have entered or escaped. The newspapers, already gathering like vultures outside the theatre, would soon trumpet the story across London: the phantom murder of Drury Lane, and death takes centre stage at the Royal Caledonian. It was, at this point, with Scotland Yard baffled and the theatrical community in uproar, that Lestrade made the decision that would bring the case to the attention of the one man in London whose mind could unravel such an impossible puzzle. The telegram he dispatched to Baker Street was brief but urgent. "Impossible murder at Royal Caledonian Theatre. Actor killed during performance in locked room beneath stage. No weapon found. Your immediate assistance required. Lestrade." The fog swirled thicker as the message made its way through London's gaslit streets, carrying with it the promise that this most theatrical of crimes would soon attract the attention of the greatest detective of the age. For in the comfortable sitting room at 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes would soon read those words and feel that familiar quickening of interest that marked the beginning of another extraordinary case. The stage was set, the impossible crime committed, and the curtain about to rise on a drama of deduction that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers to their utmost limits. The plaintive notes of a violin drifted through the fog-shrouded evening at 221B Baker Street, where Holmes sat in his customary chair, lost in one of his own melancholic compositions. The bow moved across the strings with practiced precision, each note seeming to pierce the comfortable silence that had settled over our lodgings like a familiar blanket. I had been reviewing case notes from my medical practice, occasionally glancing up to observe my friend's absorbed expression as he worked through whatever complex thoughts occupied his restless mind. The sharp rap of the front door knocker cut through the music like a blade, followed immediately by Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps upon the stairs. Holmes lowered his violin with a slight frown of annoyance, though I detected the familiar quickening of interest in his grey eyes that marked the arrival of something significant. "A telegram, Mr. Holmes," our landlady announced, slightly breathless from her ascent. The boy said it was most urgent, from Scotland Yard. Holmes set aside his instrument and accepted the yellow envelope with those long, dexterous fingers that could coax music from strings or secrets from the most reluctant evidence. As he read, I watched the transformation that never failed to fascinate me. The languid musician vanished, replaced by the keen-eyed hunter sensing promising prey. "Most intriguing, Watson," he murmured, his voice carrying that note of intellectual hunger I had learned to recognize. "Lestrade writes of an impossible murder at the Royal Caledonian Theatre. Sir Alistair Beaumont, killed during his performance in a locked chamber beneath the stage, no weapon to be found." He looked up, and I saw that familiar gleam that preceded our most extraordinary adventures. "Tell me, what do you observe about our messenger?" I glanced toward the window where the boy's retreating figure was barely visible through the fog. "Nothing remarkable, Holmes. simply a theatre messenger doing his duty. Ah, but observe his hands. Watson, or rather, what his hands have told us of his evening's work. Holmes moved to the window, his sharp profile illuminated by the gaslight. Chalk dust beneath the fingernails, rope burns fresh upon the palms, and that particular shade of sawdust clinging to his sleeve that speaks of theatrical carpentry. Our young friend has been assisting with the investigation, moving scenery and handling stage machinery. Most illuminating. I joined him at the window, though the thick fog rendered the street nearly invisible beyond the nearest lamp. You deduce all this from a glimpse? The hands, Watson, always observe the hands. They are the most honest witnesses to a man's recent activities. He turned from the window, his decision clearly made. We must depart immediately for Drury Lane. Such mysteries have a tendency to grow more complex with each passing hour, and I prefer to examine crime scenes while they remain relatively undisturbed by well-meaning officials. The hansom that carried us through London's fog-shrouded streets moved through a world transformed into something from a Gothic romance. Familiar landmarks appeared as ghostly suggestions in the yellow gaslight, and our driver was forced to slow repeatedly to navigate the treacherous visibility. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his keen mind undoubtedly already working upon the puzzle that awaited us. "Consider the essential paradox, Watson," he said at length, his voice cutting through the muffled clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones. A man descends through a trapdoor in full view of 1,000 witnesses, yet arrives below as a corpse, killed by a weapon that cannot be found in a chamber that was effectively sealed. Either we are dealing with an elaborate mechanical contrivance, or a deception so profound that it has fooled even the trained eyes of Scotland Yard. "But surely," I protested, "the very public nature of the crime makes elaborate preparation impossible. How could a murderer arrange such circumstances?" "Ah, but what if the very publicity was the murderer's greatest asset? A stage, Watson, is a place where illusion is crafted nightly, where the impossible becomes commonplace through careful preparation and misdirection. Our killer may have simply employed the theatre's own tools for his deadly purpose." The Royal Caledonian Theatre emerged from the fog like a great ship anchored in a sea of mist, its gas flames flickering behind tall windows and casting wavering shadows across the fog-dampened street. Inspector Lestrade's familiar figure appeared at the stage door as our cab drew to a halt, his sharp features drawn with fatigue and evident frustration. "Mr. Holmes," he called out, relief unmistakable in his voice. I confess myself entirely baffled by this business. The more we examine the circumstances, the more impossible they become. The body has been moved to the green room. The scene preserved as you would wish, but I warn you, this case defies every principle of criminal investigation I have ever encountered. Holmes stepped down from the cab, his keen eyes already surveying the theatre's exterior with that methodical attention to detail that marked the beginning of every investigation, while the fog swirled around us like the curtain rising on our most perplexing drama yet. The fog seemed to follow us through the stage door as Lestrade led us into the Royal Caledonian's shadowy interior, where the sharp odors of limelight, sawdust, and stale grease paint created an atmosphere thick with theatrical history. "First, Inspector," Holmes said, pausing to examine something on the door frame that had caught his keen attention. "Tell me precisely what you observed upon your arrival, before subsequent investigation contaminated your first impressions." Lestrade fell into step beside us as we navigated the maze of painted scenery and costume racks. "I arrived at 10:30, perhaps 40 minutes after the discovery. The body was exactly as found Sir Alistair, lying upon the feather mattress beneath the trapdoor. That peculiar wound in his chest, the stage dagger nearby. The understage chamber was sealed as thoroughly as any locked-room mystery you might encounter." "And the wound itself?" Holmes inquired, his magnifying glass appearing as he knelt to study fresh scratches in the mortar between the cobblestones near the entrance. "Clean puncture, narrow blade, thrust with surgical precision between the ribs. Remarkably little bleeding for such a wound, as if the weapon had been withdrawn immediately, and with considerable care. Lestrade watched Holmes examine the scratches with growing curiosity. "What do you make of those marks? Someone has been at considerable pains to remove something embedded here, working with a knife or similar implement within the last few hours." Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. "Most instructive, but let us examine the scene itself." We descended through the theatre's labyrinthine backstage areas, past the prompt corner with its speaking tubes and electric bells, until we reached the narrow wooden stair leading to the understage chamber. The space revealed itself as precisely what Lestrade had described: a timber-lined room, perhaps 10 feet square, dominated by the gaping maw of the trapdoor above and the blood-stained feather mattress below. The only exits were our stair and a heavy iron door set into the opposite wall, secured by an ancient bolt. Holmes began his examination with characteristic methodical precision, circling the chamber before approaching any evidence directly. "The trap mechanism," he said, studying the system of counterweights and pulleys mounted against one wall. "How precisely is it operated?" Horace Pike, the gaunt master carpenter who had been waiting nervously nearby, stepped forward. "From here, sir. I control the descent and timing, worked this theatre 20 years, know every rope and timber. And this door," Holmes indicated the bolted iron barrier, "found secured from this side." Lestrade interjected. "Pike swears he never bolted it, claims he always leaves it open during performances for quick access to his workshop." Holmes examined the bolt mechanism with particular interest, running his gloved fingers along the iron fittings. "Observe, Watson, how the metal here shows fresh disturbance, recent scratches where the bolt has been worked repeatedly." He moved to the blood-stained mattress, kneeling to study the pattern without touching. "The distribution suggests Sir Alistair was alive when he struck this surface, but died within seconds thereafter." Drawing on his gloves, Holmes approached the mattress more closely, separating the feathers with his pipe stem. "Here," he said, indicating a pinprick of darkness upon the ticking. "And there," pointing to a faint score upon the timber at chest height, "we find signs of a rigid point set to meet the descent." "We searched thoroughly," Lestrade protested. "There is nothing." "There is nothing now," Holmes corrected, moving to examine the counterweight line. He lifted his finger, showing a speck of red varnish. "From what source, Mr. Pike?" "We varnished Macedon's shield in the fly gallery this afternoon," the carpenter replied. "Yet this speck rests 5 feet from the floor." Holmes plucked a short black bristle from a splinter. Not horsehair from a wig, but brush hair used with shellac. He straightened, his keen eyes surveying the chamber once more. "Mr. Pike, during the performance, who had legitimate access to this area?" "Only myself, sir." "Then either someone assumed your place, or a device awaited its victim without requiring a guiding hand." Holmes raised his lantern, letting its light fall through the black mouth of the trapdoor above. "A theatre exists to make the improbable appear natural. Our murderer has simply borrowed that craft for deadlier purposes." Holmes raised his lantern higher, casting dancing shadows across the timber beams as he continued his methodical examination of the understage chamber. "Watson, observe the angle of that score mark upon the timber," he said, directing my attention to the faint line he had discovered. "Note how it slopes downward from left to right, suggesting the instrument that made it was angled precisely to meet a descending body at chest height." The mark was indeed deliberate, carved with mathematical precision rather than accidental damage. Pike shifted nervously beside us, his weathered hands fidgeting with a coil of rope. "I tell you, gentlemen, there was nothing here but the mattress when Sir Alistair made his descent. I've operated this trap 1,000 times, there's never been so much as a splinter out of place." "Yet something was here," Holmes replied, his tone carrying absolute certainty. He knelt beside the mattress, separating the feathers with his pipe stem to reveal the puncture he had noted earlier. Around this hole, the fibers are stiffened with shellac. Someone set a rigid point through this fabric and gummed the fibers to hold it true. The resinous odor was unmistakable as he warmed the spot with his pipe bowl. Moving to the base of the trap mechanism, Holmes examined the floor with his magnifying glass. Here, Watson, 4 small indentations in the sawdust, arranged in a precise square pattern, each approximately 2 inches apart. The legs of a device designed to stand at this exact spot and extend upward. During yesterday's rehearsal, Pike admitted reluctantly, there was a small wooden crate near that wall. Plain wood, perhaps 2 feet square. I thought it belonged to the property department, but when I mentioned it to Jenkins this morning, he claimed no knowledge of it. Holmes straightened, his grey eyes reflecting triumph. The murder weapon was not a blade at all, but a mechanical contrivance designed to kill with clockwork precision and vanish without trace. He examined the iron bolt once more, working it back and forth. This mechanism shows recent manipulation. Someone has been securing this door repeatedly. Between the plate and wood, he teased out a hair-fine silk thread. Drawn through a pinhole and hooked about the bolt, one tug from the passage would secure it from without. "Inspector," Holmes said as we ascended to the stage, "I shall require interviews with everyone who had access to this chamber, particularly those familiar with theatrical machinery and stage effects." Lestrade consulted his notebook. "I've identified 3 individuals who warrant immediate attention. First, Basil Fenwick, the theatre manager. He carries a substantial insurance policy on Sir Alister's life and was notably absent from the backstage area during the performance." We approached Fenwick, a portly man wringing his hands near the proscenium arch. "Inspector, Mr. Holmes, this is catastrophic. My theatre, my reputation." Sir Alister was irreplaceable. His gaze darted nervously, and Holmes's eyes lingered momentarily on the manager's highly polished boots before moving on. "Then there's Miss Lila Rowntree, the leading lady," Lestrade continued, indicating a striking woman with fiery red hair seated on a prop throne. She was on stage during the murder, but stage romances can turn complicated. Miss Rowntree looked up with red-rimmed but intense eyes. "It's an outrage. Who would dare harm such talent?" Her voice possessed dramatic resonance, and Holmes noted a tiny tear in her lace cuff and the tight clasp of her hands. Finally, Thomas Grube, a stagehand recently reprimanded by Sir Alister for tardiness. He was supposedly operating lighting cues in the fly gallery, but his alibi is questionable. Grubby, lanky with sullen features, refused to meet anyone's eye. Holmes observed his calloused hands and a dark smudge on his cheek before turning back to Lestrade. "You present us with a trinity of motives: financial gain, romantic jealousy, and professional grievance. All rather convenient, wouldn't you say? But does any of these individuals strike you as capable of constructing the ingenious mechanical device we've discovered? This was no crime of passion, Inspector, but a carefully orchestrated theatrical deception requiring intimate knowledge of stage machinery and considerable technical skill." As Holmes paced the stage, his head bowed in thought, I realized we were dealing with a murderer who had transformed the very tools of theatrical illusion into instruments of death. Someone who understood that the greatest deceptions occur in plain sight, before an audience of 1,000 witnesses. Holmes ceased his contemplation of the mechanical aspects and turned his penetrating gaze upon our assembled suspects, his manner suggesting a mind that had already begun to separate wheat from chaff. "Mr. Fenwick," he began, his tone courteous yet incisive, "your whereabouts during the fatal 4th act, if you please." The theatre manager mopped his perspiring brow with a silk handkerchief, his eyes darting nervously between us and the prompt corner. "In my office, Mr. Holmes, reconciling the evening's receipts with my clerk. The books must be balanced nightly, you understand." Holmes stooped briefly to examine the manager's highly polished boots, noting the fine white dust that clung to their edges. "Whiting powder," he murmured, "from the marble balustrade in your foyer. Your movements were confined to the front of house, as you claim. Relief flickered across Fenwick's features, though I observed Holmes's keen eyes linger momentarily upon a small smear of reddish substance near the heel. Miss Rowntree, when questioned, maintained her composure despite the evident strain of the evening's events. "My relationship with Sir Alistair was purely professional," she declared, though her voice carried undertones of suppressed emotion. "He could be demanding, certainly, but he praised my work before the entire company just last week." Holmes noted the small tear in her lace cuff and what appeared to be rope fibers upon her wrist, details that spoke of recent contact with stage rigging. "You were positioned stage left for your entrance cue?" "Yes." "Precisely where the prompt book specified." Her earnest gaze never wavered, though I sensed a proud spirit bridling under such scrutiny. Grubby, the sullen stagehand, shuffled forward when summoned, his lanky frame betraying the nervousness of a man accustomed to remaining in shadows. "Fly gallery, sir. Managing the lamp cues as directed." Holmes's attention fixed immediately upon a small puncture wound on the man's right thumb, from which a bead of dried blood was still visible. "A mishap with a nail," Grubby muttered when questioned, though his explanation came too quickly for comfort. "Careless work while repairing a plank." A small brass key protruded from his pocket, which he attempted to conceal when he noticed Holmes's interest. "For my boy's mechanical toy," he added hastily. "These three present us with the traditional trinity of motives," Holmes observed to Lestrade as we moved away from the suspects: financial desperation, romantic passion, and workplace grievance. Yet none possesses the technical expertise required for our mechanical murder device. This was no crime of sudden passion, Inspector, but a calculated deception requiring intimate knowledge of theatrical machinery and considerable engineering skill. Holmes led us to Pike's workshop, a cluttered domain filled with the tools and materials of stage carpentry. Fresh wood shavings littered the workbench, their pale color catching the lantern light. "Pine shavings," Holmes noted, lifting a curl of wood for examination. "The same species as your mysterious crate, Mr. Pike, yet you disclaim knowledge of its construction." The master carpenter's weathered face grew ashen as Holmes continued his methodical examination of the workspace. Several tools showed signs of recent use, despite Pike's claims of routine maintenance only. Holmes lifted a small metal file, studying its surface through his magnifying glass. "Steel filings mixed with what appears to be dried blood," he announced. "You mentioned cutting yourself yesterday?" Pike extended his bandaged thumb as evidence, though his explanation seemed increasingly hollow under Holmes's relentless scrutiny. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, examining the workshop's position relative to the understage chamber below. "A skilled carpenter working here would possess precise knowledge of the measurements required to position a device at exactly the right height to intercept Sir Alistair's descent." His investigation revealed traces of specialized lubricant upon the more delicate tools, an expensive compound used only for precision work requiring absolute silence. As we prepared to ascend from the workshop, Holmes paused at a collection of metalworking tools that seemed oddly out of place among the carpentry equipment. "The construction of a spring-loaded mechanism would require expertise in both woodwork and metalwork," he observed, his gaze settling meaningfully upon Jenkins, the property master, whose face had grown increasingly pale during our examination. "Skills that rarely exist in isolation, yet when combined, could produce exactly the sort of device we seek." Jenkins had grown increasingly pale during our examination of Pike's workshop, his nervous fingers drumming against a leather apron stained with various theatrical substances, and Holmes's keen eyes had not failed to notice the property master's mounting agitation. "Your workshop, Mr. Jenkins," Holmes requested with that deceptive courtesy which I had learned often preceded his most penetrating investigations. "I should very much like to examine your domain, particularly given your evident expertise in both woodwork and the finer aspects of mechanical construction." The property master's chamber occupied a cramped space adjacent to Pike's carpentry shop, its walls lined with theatrical weapons, painted shields, and the accumulated materials of countless productions. Holmes began his examination with characteristic methodical precision, his magnifying glass moving systematically across the cluttered workbench. "These metal filings are remarkably fresh," he observed, collecting a small sample of steel dust upon his fingertip, "and this vise shows clear evidence of having gripped something cylindrical within the past day." The impressions in the metal jaws were distinct and precise, suggesting repeated work upon an object approximately 1 inch in diameter. Precision calipers, microfiles, and what appears to be a small lathe, Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction that marked significant discoveries. "Tools that speak of craftsmanship far beyond the requirements of theatrical property work, Mr. Jenkins. One might almost suspect you of clockmaking rather than stage management." The property master shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward a locked cabinet in the corner, a movement that did not escape Holmes's notice. "Theater work requires versatility, Mr. Holmes," Jenkins stammered, wringing his hands with increasing agitation. "A property master must repair everything from broken sword hilts to delicate music boxes. One acquires many skills over the years." His explanation came too quickly, and I observed how his eyes avoided direct contact with Holmes's penetrating stare. "Indeed," Holmes replied, approaching the locked cabinet with obvious interest. "And these skills, when combined with intimate knowledge of the theater's mechanical systems, could prove remarkably potent. The key, if you please." With obvious reluctance, Jenkins produced a brass key from his waistcoat, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the mechanism. Holmes examined the lock briefly, noting fresh scratches around the keyhole that spoke of recent and perhaps hurried access. Among the cabinet's contents of paste jewels and gilded crowns, Holmes discovered a collection of precision springs, delicate files, and most significantly, several brass components that bore the unmistakable marks of recent machining. "Experimental devices for mechanical stage effects," Jenkins explained desperately when questioned, though his voice lacked conviction. "We considered various innovations for next season's productions." Holmes lifted one of the brass pieces, testing its weight, and examining its surface with his magnifying glass, though he made no immediate comment upon his observations. Lestrade, sensing the mounting evidence, stepped forward with official authority. "Mr. Jenkins, we've had reports that Sir Alistair was particularly harsh with you following the chandelier incident last month. Nearly brought down the entire front row, didn't it?" The property master's face grew ashen at this reminder, and he gripped the workbench for support. "An accident," Jenkins exclaimed, his voice rising in pitch. "The mechanism was old, corroded. I warned him repeatedly, but he insisted upon using it for dramatic effect. He called me incompetent before the entire company, threatened to have me dismissed after 20 years of faithful service." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, revealing depths of resentment that had clearly festered since the public humiliation. Holmes had moved to examine a small, almost imperceptible detail in the sawdust near the workbench. A faint circular indentation, too precise to be accidental and too small for any tool we had yet observed. He knelt with his magnifying glass, studying the mark with an intensity that suggested profound significance. Yet he said nothing, his features betraying no outward sign of his discovery. This was Holmes at his most enigmatic, gathering crucial evidence while maintaining the facade of routine investigation. "Your whereabouts during the fourth act?" Lestrade pressed, eager to capitalize on Jenkins's obvious distress. "In my office, preparing props for the fifth act," came the whispered reply. "The ceremonial crown, the scepter, everything must be precisely arranged. I prefer to work alone during critical moments." The absence of any witness to confirm his alibi hung heavy in the air, though I noticed Holmes seemed more interested in that mysterious indentation than in Jenkins's convenient solitude. Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful yet deliberately neutral. He had found something significant in that tiny mark, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would eventually unlock the entire mystery. But for now, he would guard his discovery with characteristic discretion. The theatre, with its elaborate machinery of illusion, had offered up its secrets to his trained eye. And I knew that behind his calm exterior, the great detective's mind was already weaving together the threads of an extraordinarily complex deception. Holmes rose from his examination of that mysterious circular indentation with the measured deliberation of a man who has discovered something of profound significance, though his expression remained carefully neutral to avoid alerting our suspects. He said quietly, drawing me aside while Lestrade continued his interrogation of the increasingly agitated Jenkins. "Observe the precision of this mark in the sawdust. Note its diameter, approximately 3/4 of an inch, and the uniform depth, suggesting considerable downward pressure applied with mechanical consistency." His magnifying glass revealed minute details invisible to the naked eye. 16 small serrations arranged in perfect symmetry around the circular impression's edge. "The base of some specialized tool?" I ventured, though the mark's purpose remained entirely opaque to me. "Indeed. But observe the pattern more closely," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of intellectual excitement he could never entirely suppress when confronted with elegant mechanical precision. "These serrations follow a mathematical progression, each point precisely spaced at 22½ degrees around the circumference. This is no common workshop tool, Watson, but something designed for very specific applications requiring absolute accuracy." He straightened, his keen gaze sweeping across Jenkins's cluttered workspace with renewed intensity, noting details that had previously escaped even his trained observation. The property master's growing pallor had not escaped Holmes's notice, and he approached the man with that deceptive gentleness which often preceded his most devastating revelations. "Mr. Jenkins, your collection of precision instruments is remarkably comprehensive for theatrical work. Might you possess a circular cutting die of approximately 3/4 inch diameter, designed for metalwork requiring extreme precision?" The question struck Jenkins like a physical blow, and his hands began trembling so violently that he was forced to grip the workbench for support. "Such tools, that is, precision work sometimes requires." Jenkins's voice failed him entirely, as Holmes moved toward a canvas-covered object in the workshop's far corner that we had not yet examined thoroughly. "This covering bears traces of that specialized lubricant we discovered earlier," Holmes observed, noting how the fabric had been arranged with obvious care to conceal whatever lay beneath. The canvas itself shows no accumulation of dust, suggesting recent placement. With deliberate slowness, he drew away the covering to reveal not the complete murder weapon, but rather an array of brass components, springs, and precision-machined parts that spoke of extraordinary mechanical sophistication. "Components for a spring-loaded mechanism," Holmes announced, lifting one of the brass pieces to examine its surface under his magnifying glass. "Observe the tool marks. Watson, each piece machined to tolerances that would challenge even the finest clockmakers. This represents weeks, perhaps months of careful preparation. The components, when examined collectively, suggested a device of remarkable ingenuity, though Holmes made no attempt to assemble them or explain their ultimate purpose." Jenkins collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands as 20 years of suppressed resentment finally found voice. "He destroyed me," the property master whispered, his words barely audible above the theatre's settling timbers. "Before the entire company, he called me a bungling incompetent, threatened to see me dismissed and blacklisted throughout London. 20 years of faithful service reduced to nothing by his cruel jest over a single mechanical failure." Holmes nodded with something approaching sympathy, though his attention had shifted to the workshop's floor, where several boards showed signs of recent disturbance. "Mr. Jenkins, this chamber occupies space above the theatre's original foundations, does it not? The timber here shows evidence of earlier construction. Different joinery techniques older materials. His examination revealed subtle but unmistakable signs that the current structure had been built upon much older foundations. The Royal Caledonian has occupied this site for nearly a century, Jenkins confirmed, seeming to find some relief in discussing neutral historical facts. The original building burned in 1847, but they preserved the understage areas and foundations when they rebuilt. This revelation sparked obvious interest in Holmes's keen features, though he made no immediate comment upon its significance. Moving to examine the workshop's relationship to the understage chamber below, Holmes discovered what appeared to be a narrow service passage, long forgotten and partially sealed, that connected the two areas through the building's original infrastructure. "Most illuminating," he murmured, though he shared none of his deductions with the rest of us, preferring to gather additional evidence before committing to any particular theory of the crime's execution. Holmes's examination of the forgotten service passage revealed evidence that would prove crucial to unraveling this most ingenious theatrical deception, though he maintained his characteristic discretion in sharing his conclusions with the rest of our party. "Watson," he said quietly, directing his powerful lamp beam toward the passage floor. "Observe these markings in the accumulated dust, not the random scuffing of occasional passage, but the deliberate tracks of something wheeled, moved repeatedly along this precise route." The impressions were indeed unmistakable once pointed out, showing the narrow tracks of small wheels approximately 1 inch in diameter, accompanied by deeper gouges where a heavy object had been dragged across uneven stones. Moving deeper into the passage, Holmes discovered additional evidence that spoke to careful planning and mechanical precision. "Here, Inspector," he announced, indicating a dark stain upon the ancient stonework. "Specialized lubricant, still viscous despite the passage of hours. Note the sweet, distinctive aroma. This is no common machine oil, but a compound designed for precision mechanisms requiring absolute silence during operation." His magnifying glass revealed minute brass filings embedded in the stone nearby, suggesting that delicate adjustments had been made to some mechanical device in this very location. The passage itself proved to be a marvel of forgotten architecture, constructed of dressed stone that predated the theatre's 1847 reconstruction and running directly beneath the trapdoor mechanism above. Holmes's methodical examination revealed a series of small holes drilled through the ceiling stones, each positioned with mathematical precision to align with specific points in the understage chamber. "Observation ports," he explained, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration he reserved for particularly elegant solutions. Our murderer required precise timing, and these apertures provided the necessary visual reference points to coordinate his device with Sir Alister's descent. At the passage's terminus, Holmes discovered what appeared to be a small workshop area, complete with mounting brackets secured to the stone walls and fresh tool marks indicating recent use. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, turning to face the property master with that penetrating stare which seemed to pierce directly through pretense, "your mechanical expertise extends considerably beyond theatrical requirements, does it not? These mounting points suggest familiarity with precision engineering that few property masters would possess." The accused man's shoulders sagged perceptibly, though he maintained his silence with obvious effort. "My father was a master clockmaker in Birmingham," Jenkins finally admitted, his voice barely audible in the confined space. "I apprenticed with him for 7 years before the theatre called, learned precision work that requires tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Sir Alister never knew of this background when he mocked my supposed incompetence before the entire company." The bitterness in his voice remained undiminished, and Holmes nodded with something approaching understanding for the man's wounded professional pride. Holmes examined the mounting brackets more closely, noting how they had been positioned to support a mechanism of considerable complexity. "A spring-loaded device," he observed, his tone suggesting he had already reconstructed its operation in complete detail, "designed to extend a sharpened steel rod at precisely the moment Sir Alister's chest would align with its trajectory, then immediately retract through this passage to prevent discovery. The mathematical precision required for such timing spoke to months of careful observation and calculation. The circular impression we discovered in your workshop marks where you tested the mechanism's base, Holmes continued, his explanation revealing the extraordinary scope of the preparation involved. Those 16 serrations were designed to grip the floorboards and prevent movement during operation, while the specialized lubricant ensured absolute silence during deployment and retraction. Each detail spoke to professional-level mechanical engineering applied to the darkest of purposes. Lestrade, who had been following Holmes's reconstruction with growing amazement, stepped forward with official authority. "Mr. Jenkins, you're under arrest for the murder of Sir Alistair Beaumont. The evidence against you is overwhelming." Yet, Holmes raised a cautionary hand, his keen eyes suggesting that additional revelations awaited discovery, and I sensed that our investigation had not yet reached its final, dramatic conclusion. Holmes's raised hand halted Lestrade's declaration with quiet authority, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity which marked his most complex deductions. "Not yet, Inspector," he said with measured precision, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the compelling evidence assembled against Jenkins. "While our property master has undoubtedly provided both the means and considerable expertise for this ingenious crime, a fundamental inconsistency prevents us from accepting so convenient a conclusion." The cramped passage fell silent, save for the distant settling of the theatre's ancient timbers, and I observed how Holmes's attention had shifted to something that had clearly been troubling his methodical mind. "Consider the iron door to the understage chamber," Holmes continued, his analytical voice cutting through the tension like a surgical instrument. "It was discovered, bolted from within, yet, by Mr. Jenkins's own account, and according to our reconstruction of events, he operated his mechanical device from this very passage. He was never inside that sealed chamber after Sir Alistair's descent, which raises a most perplexing question: how was that bolt secured from the interior? The logical impossibility hung in the air like a challenge to everything we thought we understood about the crime's execution. Jenkins looked up with desperate confusion, replacing his earlier resignation. "I worked entirely from here, Mr. Holmes, I swear it." The device extended through the mattress as designed, then retracted immediately. "I never entered that chamber, never touched that bolt." Protestation carried the ring of truth, though it only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Holmes moved to examine the bolt mechanism once more, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped our earlier scrutiny. The iron shows fresh scratches, consistent with recent operation, yet observe these peculiar marks along the bolt's edge, parallel grooves, suggesting it was worked not by human fingers, but by some form of mechanical assistance. He traced the grooves with his pipe stem, noting their uniform depth and spacing. "Watson, recall our discovery of that silk thread between the plate and wood. I initially assumed it was used to operate the bolt from the passage, but observe how it was positioned not to pull the bolt closed, but to hold it in a predetermined position." The implications of this observation struck me with sudden clarity. Someone was indeed within that chamber, I ventured, but they departed before the bolt was secured, leaving some mechanism to complete the task. "Precisely, Watson, though the mechanism was simpler than you might imagine." Holmes knelt beside the doorframe, his keen eyes studying the junction between stone and timber. "Here, nearly invisible, unless one knows precisely where to look, we find a small hole drilled through the doorframe at an angle calculated to intersect with the bolt's path." His probe revealed a narrow channel extending through the ancient wood, barely wider than a knitting needle. "A delayed action mechanism," Holmes explained, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration reserved for particularly elegant solutions. "A thin steel rod, inserted through this channel and positioned to catch the bolt at a predetermined angle. When Sir Alistair's weight struck the mattress below, the vibration would dislodge the rod, allowing the bolt to slide home under its own weight and the theatre's natural settling." The mechanical simplicity was brilliant in its effectiveness, requiring no springs or clockwork, merely precise positioning and the building's own movement. Holmes's examination of the understage area revealed additional evidence supporting this theory. Fresh metal filings around the drilled hole, and here, embedded in the timber, a fragment of steel wire precisely the diameter required for our hypothetical rod. He extracted the fragment with his tweezers, holding it to the lamplight. The break is clean, suggesting the rod was designed to snap under pressure, leaving only this tiny remnant as evidence of its existence. But who operated this secondary mechanism? Lestrade demanded, his frustration evident as the case grew more complex rather than approaching resolution. Someone with intimate knowledge of the theatre's construction and access to precision drilling equipment, Holmes replied, his gaze settling meaningfully upon Pike, whose weathered face had grown increasingly pale during this exposition. Someone whose presence in the understage area would occasion no surprise, whose movements would be considered routine maintenance rather than suspicious preparation. The master carpenter's hands trembled as he gripped his coil of rope, though he maintained his silence with obvious effort. Holmes moved to examine Pike's tool belt, noting the presence of a hand drill and several steel rods of varying diameters. Your explanation for the bandaged thumb, Mr. Pike, you mentioned cutting yourself on a nail yesterday. Yet observe the wound's position and angle, perfectly consistent with a slip while drilling through hardwood at an awkward angle. The evidence was accumulating with inexorable logic, though Holmes's expression suggested additional revelations awaited discovery. The collaboration was more extensive than either party initially admitted, Holmes observed, his tone carrying that note of certainty which marked his most profound deductions. Jenkins provided the engineering expertise and constructed the primary mechanism, while Pike contributed his knowledge of the theatre's hidden spaces and operated both the trapdoor and the secondary bolt mechanism. A perfect division of criminal labor, each man contributing his particular skills to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. The conspiracy's architecture revealed itself as remarkably sophisticated, transforming what had appeared to be a single man's revenge into an elaborate partnership born of mutual grievance and complementary expertise. Pike's weathered hands trembled as he released his grip on the rope coil, the tool of his trade falling to the passage floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo the collapse of his carefully constructed deception. 20 years, he whispered hoarsely, his voice carrying the hollow resonance of a man whose world had suddenly contracted to the dimensions of a confession. 20 years of faithful service, and he destroyed us both in a single evening's cruel jest. The master carpenter's shoulders sagged under the weight of Holmes's inexorable logic, and I observed how the accumulated evidence had finally broken through his stubborn resistance. Holmes nodded with something approaching compassion, though his keen eyes continued their methodical cataloguing of the final details. The conspiracy required extraordinary coordination, he observed, his analytical voice reconstructing the crime's intricate choreography. Mr. Jenkins designed and constructed the primary mechanism with clockmaker's precision, a spring-loaded device concealed within that mysterious wooden crate, positioned to extend a sharpened steel rod at precisely the moment Sir Alister's chest would align with its trajectory. But the engineering genius, however remarkable, required your intimate knowledge of the theatre's hidden architecture to achieve success. Pike's confession emerged in broken fragments, each admission extracted like a painful splinter. We met at the Lamb and Flag after that terrible night, when Sir Alister humiliated us before the entire company. Jenkins spoke of mechanical possibilities, how precision devices could serve purposes beyond mere timekeeping. I knew every forgotten passage, every abandoned foundation in this building. His voice grew stronger as the burden of secrecy lifted. The rehearsals provided perfect cover. Each practice session allowed us to refine the timing, test components, measure distances without arousing suspicion. Holmes examined the drilled hole in the doorframe once more, his magnifying glass revealing microscopic details that completed the picture. Your secondary mechanism was elegantly simple. a thin steel rod positioned to secure the bolt through vibration alone. You operated the trapdoor with your usual precision while simultaneously ensuring the understage chamber would seal itself after Sir Alister's descent, creating the perfect locked room mystery. The red varnish speck at 5 feet upon the counterweight line marked your timing cue, Holmes continued, his reconstruction revealing months of careful preparation. The black brush bristle we discovered came from your final adjustments to the mechanism yesterday afternoon. Every detail was calculated with mathematical precision, from the angle of penetration to the immediate retraction that would prevent discovery of the weapon. Jenkins, who had remained silent during Pike's breakdown, finally found his voice. "It was never meant to be murder," he protested weakly, though his words lacked conviction even to himself. "We thought perhaps an injury, something to humble his arrogance without." The pathetic justification died in his throat as Holmes's grey eyes fixed upon him with quiet condemnation. "Yet you constructed a mechanism designed to penetrate between ribs with surgical precision," Holmes replied, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The steel rod was sharpened to a needle point, positioned at exactly the angle required to pierce the heart. This was no accident of passion, gentlemen, but premeditated murder disguised as theatrical mishap. At this moment, Holmes executed a masterstroke that demonstrated why his reputation for strategic thinking remained unparalleled. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I believe our demonstration has served its purpose." From his coat pocket, he produced a small brass component that glinted in the lamplight. This spring housing, discovered hidden beneath loose floorboards in Mr. Jenkins's workshop, still bears traces of the specialized lubricant and shows clear evidence of recent assembly. The mechanism was designed for complete disassembly after use, its components scattered to prevent reconstruction of the evidence. Lestrade stepped forward with grim satisfaction, his earlier confusion replaced by professional certainty. "Horace Pike, William Jenkins, you are both under arrest for the willful murder of Sir Alister Beaumont. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your own confessions have sealed your fate." The metallic click of handcuffs provided punctuation to 20 years of friendship reduced to shared culpability. As the prisoners were led away through the theatre's fog-shrouded stage door, Holmes stood contemplating the elaborate deception that had transformed artistic illusion into deadly reality. "A remarkable case, Watson," he observed, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction which marked successful resolution of complex puzzles. They proved that the most dangerous criminals are often those who possess both technical expertise and intimate knowledge of their chosen battlefield, transforming the very tools of dramatic illusion into instruments of revenge. The fog had begun to lift as Pike and Jenkins were led through the theatre's stage door into the grey dawn of a London morning. Their 20-year friendship reduced to shared culpability in the most ingenious theatrical murder Scotland Yard had ever encountered. Holmes watched their departure with that characteristic detachment which marked his professional assessment of criminal enterprise, though I detected a note of genuine admiration for the mechanical precision they had achieved. "Remarkable craftsmanship, Watson," he observed as we followed in their wake, his keen eyes surveying the awakening street with satisfaction. They transformed the very essence of theatrical illusion into an instrument of perfect revenge, each contributing his specialized knowledge to create what neither could have accomplished alone. The hansom that carried us through London's fog-shrouded streets moved through a world slowly emerging from darkness, familiar landmarks materializing like stage sets revealed by lifting curtains. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his mind undoubtedly cataloguing the final details of a case that had tested even his remarkable powers of deduction. "Consider the profound irony, Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that philosophical tone which often followed our most complex investigations. "Sir Alister, who built his reputation upon commanding every aspect of theatrical performance, was ultimately destroyed by the very machinery that supported his art. His killers understood that the greatest deceptions occur not through elaborate trickery, but through the manipulation of expectation itself. As our cab rattled through the awakening city, Holmes elaborated upon the mechanical marvel that had made the murder possible. The precision required was extraordinary, months of careful observation to determine exact trajectories, mathematical calculations to position the spring-loaded mechanism at precisely the right height, and clockmaker's skill to construct a device that would operate with split-second timing. His admiration for the technical achievement remained untainted by moral consideration, a detachment that continued to fascinate me about my friend's analytical mind. Yet, for all their mechanical genius, Holmes continued, Pike and Jenkins made the fundamental error that betrays most criminal conspiracies. They underestimated the cumulative weight of physical evidence, the specialized lubricant, the brass filings, the precisely drilled holes, the coordinated timing. Each element was brilliant in isolation, but collectively they formed an unmistakable pattern pointing inevitably toward collaboration. I reflected upon the evening's revelations as familiar Baker Street approached through the dissipating mist. The insurance theory that initially attracted Lestrade's attention to Fenwick proved entirely false, I observed, the policy having lapsed a fortnight before the murder. Miss Rowntree's rope burns came from honest rehearsal work, and Grubbay's mysterious brass key wound nothing more sinister than his son's mechanical toy soldier. Precisely, Watson. The obvious suspects provided convenient misdirection while the true conspirators operated beneath our notice, their very familiarity with the theatre's hidden spaces rendering their movements invisible. Holmes drew out his pipe, tamping tobacco with absent precision. This case demonstrates the increasing sophistication of criminal methodology in our modern age. Where once murderers relied upon brute force or crude poison, we now encounter individuals who apply scientific principles and mechanical expertise to their deadly purposes. Mrs. Hudson greeted our return with characteristic blend of relief and mild reproach, having spent the night worrying about our safety in the fog-shrouded streets. Holmes accepted her ministrations with uncharacteristic patience, though I sensed his restless mind already turning toward other matters. The Morning Post has brought several interesting communications, he observed, examining accumulated correspondence with obvious anticipation. A curious affair involving a disappearing violinist in Brighton and what appears to be an impossible theft from a locked vault in the city. As Holmes settled into his familiar chair with his violin and the day's correspondence, the extraordinary events at the Royal Caledonian Theatre began assuming their proper place in our catalogue of solved mysteries. The fog had lifted completely, revealing a London morning bright with possibility, though somewhere in the city's vast complexity, new puzzles were undoubtedly taking shape, waiting for the unique genius of Sherlock Holmes to illuminate their hidden truths. The curtain had fallen upon this particular drama, but the great theatre of crime would continue its eternal performance, and we would be ready when the next impossible case demanded our attention.